Our last speaker, Francis Menton. Okay, I did not have he scribbled down some stuff here, so hopefully I get it all right. I see you have a suspect education. We'll just blow over that. He has three. He's a Yale undergraduate and also a graduate of Harvard Law School. Well, okay, that aside, you also are you put that to good use, being a lawyer for the petitioners in Check versus EPA. For those of you who don't know it, that is a lawsuit designed to take on the endangerment finding, I believe. Is that correct? On CO2. Oh, is it? I didn't even see it. Yeah, I can read. No, I actually didn't see it. You're the president for the American Friends of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, and he runs a contrarian blog called the Manhattan Contrarian Blog. So without any further ado, Francis.
And I keep hearing people when they ask questions say where they're from, and I haven't heard anyone say they're from Manhattan yet. So I think I'm the only person at this conference who actually lives on the island of Manhattan. Oh, we got another one? I thought you said you lived in Amityville, but maybe well, other people who have asked questions have asked, why aren't there more lawsuits? Why isn't anybody doing anything about this? Can't it be stopped in the courts? Well, there are limits to what you can do in the courts, but some things can be stopped in the courts and some things can't. And I am a lawyer for a group that is challenging the EPA's so-called endangerment finding in the courts. This endangerment finding is not a small thing. I don't know how many people here know that much about it, but I'm going to start off by educating you on that. Frankly, I can't think of anything more absurd and ridiculous than the idea that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at concentrations in the hundreds of parts per million is a danger to human health and welfare. It's completely ridiculous. Okay, here's the situation we're in. The federal government, via the EPA, has issued a determination that carbon dioxide is a danger to human health and welfare. And that is called the endangerment finding. And the endangerment finding underlies the entire government regulatory program relating to climate change. And President Biden and his all of government regulations, from shutting down pipelines, from there are 10 different regulatory initiatives in the EPA. There's the Department of Energy, there's FERC, the Federal Reserve, the SEC has gotten into the action with climate disclosures, and more. There are many dozens. I think we've tried to make a count. It could be more than 100 different regulatory initiatives to suppress fossil fuels, all stemming out of this thing called the endangerment finding. How in hell did we ever get in this position? So I'm going to give you some history. EPA and I guess other regulatory agencies have a petition process, where if you think they're either regulating too much or too little, you can submit a petition to the agency and try to get them to either add or subtract the regulation by pointing out that what they're doing is not in accordance with the law. Going back to the early 2000s, a group of blue states led by Massachusetts and New York petitioned the EPA to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant. And that petition was initially denied by the EPA and the Bush administration, but it then worked its way through the courts and got to the Supreme Court in 2007. And the Supreme Court in 2007 ruled that EPA must consider whether carbon dioxide is a pollutant. And if it finds that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a danger to human health and welfare, then it may and indeed must regulate. So that decision, called Massachusetts v. EPA, came out in 2007. The Bush administration should have got right on it and found it wasn't a danger, but they didn't do it. And so they left office, and when Obama came in 2009, they got right on it. within a few months had proposed this endangerment finding. And unlike the regulations that Sterling Burnett was talking about that didn't attract many comments, the proposed endangerment finding got multiple 100,000 comments, including multiple 100,000 comments, including, I'm sure, many people at this conference put in comments, but of course those were overwhelmed by 10 times as many comments from the other side. And on December 7th, 2009, a day which shall live in infamy, the Obama administration EPA adopted the endangerment finding and found that carbon dioxide was a danger to human health and welfare. How could they possibly have found that? Now, but my presentation is, I call slide light, but I have a couple of slides. And so the document is, with all its support and so forth, there's hundreds of pages, but it all boils down to basically one thing, where they say, we find carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are a danger to human welfare based on 3 lines of evidence. And this is the quote from the document. I hope it can be read from where you are. I tried to put it in big type. So there are 3 lines of evidence, says the EPA in 2009. The first line of evidence arises from the basic physical understanding of how greenhouse effect works. The second line of evidence arises from changes in global surface temperature. I've bolded the more important words. And the third line of evidence arises from the computer-based climate models. 3 lines of evidence. That's how they know that carbon dioxide is a danger to human health and welfare. I think anybody here can see that 2 of the 3 lines of evidence are not actually evidence, right? 2 of the 3 are the hypothesis rather than the evidence. The basic physical understanding and the computer-based models, those are the hypothesis. The only actual evidence that they rely upon is the surface temperature record, to show you how completely thin this whole thing is. Okay. That is adopted in 2009, and during the 8 years of Obama administration, the scientific case for carbon dioxide as a danger for human health and welfare, which started out as essentially nothing, only got worse and worse as more evidence came out, but nobody came forward to attack this. There actually was an appeal from this that some friends of mine, including one of my co-counsel now, did. It went to the DC Circuit in 2011, and they slapped that down. But other from that, nobody tried to undo the endangerment finding until when Trump got elected. People, including people I work with, thought, here's a chance. Trump will take a look at this. So after Trump got elected, we put together this group, the Concerned Household Electricity Consumers Council, known as CHEC, otherwise known as 6 Friends of Mine. We put together council, which is Harry McDougald and myself. Some of you may know Harry McDougald. And we have a scientific team led by a guy named Jim Wallace, who has a long career in basically major corporations doing forecasting, modeling, and research and development projects and statistical analysis. So he leads the science team, but some other people who are here are on the science team, including Tom Sheehan and Joe DeLeo, I think, is not here. John Christie co-authored some of the papers that we rely on. So you may know some of those names. So when Trump came in, we put together this team. It's all entirely pro bono, and we put in a petition on the first day of the Trump administration, January 20, 2017. And there it sat. We thought the Trump EPA would get right on this, but they didn't want to do it. They had other ideas of how they might approach the problem, which I don't want to say were necessarily stupid, but this endangerment finding is a cancer in the government, and it's a cancer on the country. And the Trump EPA was never really willing to tackle it. During the Trump administration, we put in 7 supplemental petitions. We kept putting out papers. We kept relying on new evidence. Nothing happened. And on the last day of the Trump administration, with a 2-page perfunctory order, they denied our petition. Now, they probably had some theory, some grand strategy they were thinking of what we might do, but the Biden people came in and realized that 2-page denial would never stand up. So the first thing they did was rescind that, and then they sat around for a year and a half, and in April of 2022, they denied our petition with a long 50 or so page word salad, a smokescreen of gobbledygook. And there we were. Now we're in the Biden administration where we're petitioning for reconsideration of the endangerment finding. Now, are you really, so if you win this in court, what you're going to get is an order to go back to the EPA to have them reconsider it. So that's an issue. On the other hand, this may take a while to get through the courts. So it may be that this ultimately comes down when there's a Republican administration in office. So we decided to file a lawsuit challenging the EPA's denial, which we did in May of 2022. And that is in the DC Circuit because this kind of case goes to the DC Circuit. It doesn't have to go through a district court. And so that is proceeding. In fact, the briefing on the case, it's all done by briefing. So there's no trial involved. The briefing was concluded just last week, and they set the oral argument for April 14th. So that's where it is. It's very much active. Now, on what basis are we challenging this? You know, the science here is so flimsy, and you get a very limited amount of words and amount of arguments that you can make. You don't get to say a lot of things. So we had to pick a few of the very best zingers, and there's all kinds of things that we could have said that we left out for lack of space. But I'll give you the highlights of some of our most important arguments. You would think they're almost irrefutable, but we're in the DC Circuit, so we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. The first one, you look at that, I still have it up. The second line of evidence, which is the only one which is evidence, actually, of the 3, so you'd think that would be the key, the surface temperature record, the global surface temperature record. Well, if you've been to panels at this thing for the last day and a half, you know that global surface temperature record is incomplete and corrupted and fabricated and faked and altered in 100 different ways. Now, we don't have nearly the words to deal with that in these briefs, so we had to pick out one thing, and the thing that we particularly picked out is that the global surface temperature record, which exists from a little before 1900 up to the present, has essentially no data in it, no unfabricated data, for the Southern Hemisphere oceans all the way up to 2000. So that the Southern Hemisphere oceans are 80% of the Southern Hemisphere, so 40% of the Earth's surface. And it's for 80+% of the time period in question. And the data, such as it is in this record that is used to so-called prove anthropogenic global warming, is infilled by algorithms into the global surface temperature record. They have essentially no raw data. Well, that's a pretty good point. We could have made a lot of other points about the fake and fabricated and altered surface temperature record, but that's the main one we picked. The next thing, the basic physical understanding. I'm going to see if I could advance this a slide. When they came out with this finding back in 2009, when they talked about the basic physical understanding and then they wrote up what they mean, well, they talked about the greenhouse effect. And how do we know there's a greenhouse effect? The famous thing is the tropical hotspot. And in fact, the endangerment finding came out in 2009. 2007 was when the IPCC's fourth assessment report came out. And the slide that I put up is the slide from the fourth assessment report of the IPCC that came out in 2007. And specifically the thing they relied upon when they talked about their basic physical understanding of the climate. The slide in the middle on the left is the slide that shows the greenhouse effect forcing. This is the IPCC slide that the EPA specifically relied on, and they even said if this doesn't show up in the data, it is a major inconsistency. Well, we all know it did not show up in the data. So this entire line of evidence, the basic physical understanding, which is based on how the greenhouse effect works, which is illustrated by the hotspot, and this is their illustration, can't be found in the data. Okay, so that's a second thing that we point out. I'll give you a couple more. A third thing we point out, 3 to 4 minutes. A third thing we point out, one of the papers that was put together with Jim Wallace, who I mentioned as the lead author, is a structural econometric analysis of causation, and the question being addressed is from the existing data, can you exclude the possibility that the warming that has been observed might have been caused by factors other than human CO2 emissions, including oceanic, volcanic, and ocean current El Nino causes. And the conclusion of the paper is these research results clearly demonstrate that once the solar, volcanic, and ocean activity impacts on temperature data are accounted for, there is no record-setting warming to be concerned about. In fact, there is no natural factor-adjusted warming at all. So that is a third point we make. And a fourth point we make, which you've also heard quite a bit about at this conference, is that all the extreme events which they rely on, it's not listed in their lines of evidence, but they do talk about extreme events, and we cite considerable data for the proposition that there is no unusual amount of extreme events. That's the right way to put it. We also, one final thing, in our last supplemental petition, which actually was submitted after the Biden administration began, we cited and got into the record the Happer von Weingarten paper on the physics of absorption of energy by carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and why that means it's unlikely that carbon dioxide would have a large effect on temperature. So we cited that, and the CO2 Coalition also submitted an amicus brief on our behalf, which was authored in part by Happer and also by Professor Lindsay. Well, there we are. The case is now submitted to the court. The briefing is complete. The argument is April 14th. I'm happy to report that the EPA's response to our contentions is as flimsy as the endangerment finding was to begin with. I would call it a smokescreen of verbiage. It's really designed to cover over the fact that they have no answers on the actual science. They put a lot of their effort into trying to knock us out on technical issues like standing, which it's actually the part of the brief that I wrote, but I won't bore this audience with the technicalities of that unless somebody is interested in it. And they make arguments like we should have, these are arguments you had to make years ago, or maybe they're arguments you can't make yet because the evidence isn't complete. So there's a lot of argument on their side on technicalities rather than science because they don't have much science. So with that, I will stop. I just reemphasize this endangerment finding is the biggest cancer in our government. It is the basis for the whole idea that the government can, without further legislation, wildly regulate all over the place to suppress fossil fuels.